Hello, and welcome to In Pursuit of Clarity, episode number 49, entitled How We Might Live Differently. I think as a general rule of human nature, we're all very good at pointing out and discussing what's wrong with the world, and it's certainly the easier part of the equation, because any healthy intuition practically screams, this is wrong, or this is unhealthy, in most of these cases. But speaking to modes of thinking and living we might replace these negatives with tends to be a bit more difficult, and certainly less frequently done. And yet it couldn't be much more important, of course. After all, we don't just need to see the error of our current ways, but also have ever present in mind concrete examples of how we might do and live better. And so, I return to a subject I've covered a few times in the past here, and hope you'll pardon me if I repeat or reiterate things I've already voiced, though I think even this repetition is sometimes worthwhile. The most important things should be repeated, especially when they can be framed in slightly different ways to more fully and comprehensively communicate the core points. Having said that, I don't think there should be too much repetition or redundancy here, and hopefully you'll find something of value, or something that spurs you to think or conceive of some topic or idea or concept in a new or helpful way. This particular cast is both dedicated to, and to some degree oriented toward, that impressive group of folks creating something very real and tangible in the Ozarks territory as we speak, spearheaded by Arval and a handful of others. And it's my hope that they'll find at least portions of it relevant. As we go, I'll probably be shifting between speaking to the more narrow and specific elements of how a parallel society or community might function, and the more broad-level philosophical and conceptual ideas and principles that might help define the how and why, and such a parallel structure's reason for being. So there's no strict and rigid specific theme for this one, and I'll probably wander a bit where I feel it's most helpful to cover more ground. And so, let's begin. I've gradually come to believe strongly in the conception that there are essentially two polar opposite future paths extending out before us, and which of these we choose to adopt will have the most powerful ramifications for every aspect of the manner in which we live, and our health, happiness, our fruitfulness and productivity, and the sum total of what we're able to accomplish. The first is the path of parasitism, of leadership or powerful figures, especially at the highest and behind-the-scenes levels, that seek to maximally profit on the backs of a compliant and indoctrinated population, encouraging all manners of weakening and degenerate and distracting behaviors to ensure said population never becomes robust or clear-sighted or organized enough to be a threat, and ensuring the collective focus for the vast majority of people is on simply earning enough to keep food on their plate and shelter over their heads. Ideally, even incurring various sorts of debt in the process to further ensure total dependence. The second path is similar to a more organically crafted and traditional hierarchical structure, the ideal form of which might be equated to that of a loving father at the head of a household, genuinely wanting to strengthen and fundamentally improve his family, and ensure they're able to live in a manner in which they're gradually refined, not drained and weakened, and not forever locked in this reptile brain mode, fearful and unsure of how they're going to pay the bills or procure their basic necessities, but instead able to devote their time to meaningful, life-affirming, constructive, and worthwhile pursuits. Whether this is some monarchical structure, or some similar aristocratic or meritocratic hierarchy, the key difference is that only those with the strongest connection to and love for the population at large are ever considered for positions of power and influence. I'd suggest that we've now traveled so far down this first path that we've become almost incapable of even fully envisioning or conceptualizing the second. So widespread is this delusion that some of the most heavily indoctrinated and conditioned might look at our current state of being and think to themselves, things seem efficient enough to me. Market forces, supply and demand, the average person is able to enjoy cell phones and big screen TVs, and now have access to a variety of things their ancestors could only dream of. What's so bad about all of this? Firstly, I think it's a profound mistake to equate technological progress with this parasitism rampant in our current structures. Tech progress which largely occurs in spite of, and not because of, these parasitic elements, who not only help hijack and reorient this progress in a direction that most exclusively benefits them and their subset. Again, think mindless distractions, think cheapening and weakening of the mind, body, and soul. But also who so often seem to arrive on the scene after the fact, a bit like jackals stumbling upon a kill, and find creative ways to maximally profit as a result. Try to pull your perspective back quite a bit for a moment, and consider how many people you know who currently work at jobs in which their time and energy isn't directly translating into something obviously fruitful. Examples of this fruitful work don't necessarily need to involve procuring necessities, like food, clothing, shelter, etc., but include even things like genuine education, or properly raising a child, or beautifying our surroundings and environments, or, in the same vein, artistic pursuits, or anything with the potential to directly help boost the physical, mental, and spiritual health or well-being of themselves or their neighbors. Think of that person sitting near a phone all day to field the occasional call to route it to some department, or engaging in spreadsheet work to help a large multinational company save a small percentage on their taxes, or somehow increase their bottom line. Think of day traders or advertisers who compete against one another to hype their variant of a similar product in attempts to win a larger market share. In short, think of what a massive percentage of occupations now seem somewhat artificial or unnecessary, or so many layers removed from genuine creative production that, in a parallel societal construct, could probably be done away with completely. And let's now consider the opposite extreme. Let's picture a group of individuals creating a parallel societal structure who have mastered the arts of all of the basics, who can grow crops, hunt or domesticate and breed and slaughter food animals, construct homes, process materials for clothing and furniture, etc. Let's pretend that nearly every single one of them has mastered one or more of the great many skill sets in these categories. And, for the sake of this hypothetical, even that they make optimal use of net positive technology to ensure they're working as efficiently as is possible. In this hypothetical, think of how few people it might take to feed an entire town, assuming access to sufficient land, materials, and the mastery of relevant skill sets. This certainly isn't to say that everything would go perfectly from moment one in this scenario, or that there wouldn't be serious trials or hurdles and hardships along the way. Of course there would. But what I'm suggesting is that, in time, a dynamic would develop in which all of the most important basics and necessities were being fully handled with ease by either a relatively small handful of the total population or by the majority of the entire population working relatively few hours. And they'd be capable of accomplishing such a feat due to the fact that there was no chaotic and wasteful dissipation of energies working at nonsense tasks, but rather efficiently and prudently channeled energy. And what this means, broadly speaking, is that there'd be an increasing amount of excess energy to be tapped into, both on the individual level and the group level. I'd suggest this is one of the many reasons, historically speaking, that so many branches of the Indo-European people tree became such skilled warriors, and so mastered the arts of shipbuilding, weapon and armor crafting, so mastered the horse and the training of working dogs, etc. Because they were able to so well handle the basics of life, this essentially freed up the excess time and energy they might then devote to what could be called luxury pursuits, or simply more advanced pursuits. Even play and recreation. And I'd like to make the incredibly important point here, because I'm not sure I've spoken to it effectively in the past, that play and recreation, and otium, as Friedrich Nietzsche called it, is a vital ingredient. I'd hate to ever convey the impression that because we've become so soft and degenerate and so thoroughly weakened, that our only hope now is mind-numbing drudgery and a lifetime of working like pack mules to regain and rediscover that hardness. Not in the least. I feel the goal should be a combination of working smarter, not harder, wherever possible, while simply ensuring this work is obviously and directly beneficial. But then to consciously use the wealth of free time and general abundance that eventually results in effective ways. To take up valuable hobbies and life-enriching pursuits, but also to learn to play well, and perhaps to consciously master the art of thinking and communicating well. Great advancements and innovations, both in the realm of material technology, or philosophy, or even spiritual understanding, all tend to happen when we are, at least in part, freed from this anxiety and uncertainty, this daily fear of simply making ends meet, and this structure in which shrewdly parasitic forces find ever more creative ways to make our dollar worth far less, to increase our fees and debts and various charges everywhere possible, and where such a large and ever-increasing percentage of people find themselves further and further in a hole, despite technically working ever more hours. This type of living can gradually drain and destroy a person in certain respects. And we currently live in nations filled to the brim with destroyed, or half-destroyed, or presently being destroyed people. And of course, there's an increasing desperation, exhaustion, and hopelessness as a result. The profound difference between the two paths mentioned a moment ago is that the parasitic archetype seeks to cultivate a structure or a power pyramid or hierarchy in which their type or culture is clearly on top, occupying the positions of foremost power and influence, and this is all that matters. I'd suggest this is the sum total purpose of their approach. This is the end goal. Not a means to an end, but the end itself. The fruitful productivity of the population hardly matters one whit, as long as their own cut or percentage of this productivity is the most significant, relatively. The happiness or well-being of the population couldn't possibly matter less, just as long as they never lean toward open revolt, or a flipping the tables and orchestrating a reset or revolution. The pursuit of lofty aims or goals, greatness or great achievements, the creation of timelessly beautiful works of art or architecture, or the informing and educating and strengthening of the people, these things essentially don't even factor into their equation. A parasitic market economy only cares about the economic bottom line, and beautifying the world or improving people doesn't lead to windfall profits. The second path mentioned, perhaps resembling the ideal monarch or benevolent dictator or king, or even an aristocratic structure or a council of elders, or something similar to the patrician class in Rome, would represent a fatherly role in which their foremost goal, stemming directly from a resonance with and genuine love for their own people, was, historically speaking, and in its best and purest form, to improve them and their lives in every conceivable way. Human nature is easily corrupted. History certainly proves this, time and time again. So many may be thinking to themselves that this second variant is essentially an impossibility, an overly idealistic pipe dream. But looking back at history again, we find this just isn't true. Yes, it's the more difficult and exceptional path. Yes, it requires that we turn our back on this ghastly multicultural experiment. And it requires some reorientation and recalibration of how many of us view life and view our world. But this is the entire point. The problem is that we've gradually moved so far away from this conception that many now seem convinced of its impossibility. Ironically, one of the reasons it can feel so impossible is because our nations not only increasingly operate as mere marketplaces, but because we've been pushed and coaxed so far down the path of multiculturalism that our level of mutual resonance, the degree to which we see our fellow citizen or our neighbor as true kith and kin, as family, as someone we actively want to help succeed, has plummeted to levels scarcely seen before. If you happen to grow up in a place like Minnesota, or in a nation like Sweden, and you wake up one day to suddenly find your region flooded with Somali migrants, for example, migrants who, broadly speaking, take ever more, demand ever more, and begin to commit a vastly disproportionate amount of crime, including murder, rape, assault, etc. How likely are you to want to work yourself to the bone to pay taxes? How inspired might you be to want to do everything in your power to work to beautify or improve your home or neighborhood or city, or to devote your time and labor to improving your neighbor's lot? Especially when these incoming populations are increasingly openly hostile and refusing to integrate, it's completely understandable how an atomized sort of libertarianism is becoming a bit more common, and how the idea of a genuine nation, a people bound by shared history, culture, language, even aims and ideals and goals, seems more and more of an impossibility and a foreign concept. So much so, in fact, that many of us threaten to lose sight of it completely. Some may even attempt to argue, but we live in a changing world, and we can't stop this change, so why shouldn't we lose sight of it completely, and learn to think and live differently? The answer is simple. We live in a negatively changing world precisely due to, and as a result of, this passive and submissive mindset in the face of challenges. Moreover, living in a wholly atomized and self-seeking way is a truly terrible prescription for nations and peoples, and lowers our ceiling, our potential, massively. It gradually makes us not only increasingly incapable of great things, but increasingly incapable of even conceiving of them, or the how and why behind them. It's a simple and incontrovertible fact that groups of people with some unity and cohesion and common cause and purpose are vastly more powerful than any collection of merely self-seeking individuals. The benefits of a multitude of like-minded and mutually resonant people working together toward common causes, goals, and ideals are innumerable, and not only in obvious and straightforward ways, but in a broader, yet perhaps more difficult to define and quantify, quality of life sense. Being able to know you're surrounded by friends, allies, and well-wishers, as opposed to a multitude of strangers speaking different languages, adhering to vastly different cultures and belief systems, many of whom may have even been taught to feel an outright animosity for you. There's simply no comparison between these two states of being, or these two societal paths. This ravenously parasitic element, in my opinion, has gained such immense ground in recent decades and centuries that it threatens to dominate completely and stand unopposed, threatens to ensure their worldview is all-pervasive, omnipresent, inescapable, again, to the extent that we gradually come to forget other possibilities. And here we come to an all-important point I'm not sure I've made before, and if I have, one that I certainly haven't stressed enough. I believe we're capable of creating something different, striking out down a new path and rediscovering and pioneering a new way to live, not just for ourselves, but holding out this model for all other peoples and cultures at arm's length and encouraging its adoption. And not even purely from an impulse of kindness or magnanimity or human decency, but for concrete, logical, and strategic reasons. After all, a parasite needs hosts to feed. The greater the number of unsuspecting and hoodwinked hosts, the stronger this parasitic force inevitably becomes. If the world at large might someday gradually come to discern the existence of these two potential paths, and just how much virtually every single individual has to gain from finding some way to pursue the latter of the two, in their own nations and on their own territories, in their own ways, the results could be incredibly positive longer term. This is one of the many reasons I've gradually become so unconditionally against any sort of exploitation and against the Talmudic enslavement instinct, against any impulse towards the using and abusing of our fellow mankind for the purposes of economic or material gain. I've come to believe that unchaining ourselves from this bleak future is an excellent and necessary first step, but trailblazing a path and making it clear to others that they might do the same in their own way has become such an intriguing prospect. Again, a parasite that finds nowhere to feed gradually shrivels and dies of its own accord, and this should be the goal. In fact, one might argue it's even more effective than a head-on attack in most cases, as this unique parasitic archetype has absolutely mastered the art of playing the victim, and manipulatively and deceptively using pity as a bludgeon, as a will to power, and means of self-preservation, and wealth and power preservation and gain, and succeed in doing so, wildly, because they now so control the shaping, conditioning, and orienting, not only of our information stream, but subsequently and over time, even the very way we think and process the world. I'd suggest that we now live in an age of theater, of puppets, actors, role players, and of controlled opposition, not just with individual human beings playing these subversive roles, but ideas and philosophies, societal and cultural and political structures and constructs. I believe the explanation as to why this theater has come to so dominate is actually simple and straightforward. It's the best possible and most shrewdly effective means to allow us all to continue down the natural paths our instincts and our will and drive and ambitions push us down, to expend our natural energies and superficially feel as if we're working towards some larger goal, for example with political action, while at the same time never truly upsetting the figurative apple cart of the real architects of modernity behind the scenes. A perfect example of this, of course, is our political arena, not just in the US, but across most of the world. We've allowed ourselves to be locked into a framework in which we tend to be supporting one of two teams, neither of which deeply resonates with the vast majority of the public anymore, in any genuine sense. And certainly and especially not the vast majority of psychologically healthy or well-bred or well-oriented people. One of the side effects of all of this, of being locked within these frameworks, is that our arguments become increasingly fruitless and impotent, because increasingly incapable of striking at the heart of our problems. We are all now pinned below layer upon layer of misapprehension and misunderstanding, of dishonest narratives and faulty premises, to the degree that almost any Republican versus Democrat type argument is an exercise in complete futility. Of course, there are the small handful of highly partisan folks on both sides, the paid or otherwise incentivized, mixed with a number of genuine true believers, which they can then shrewdly push to the forefront to help provide a veneer of legitimacy and convey the deceptive image that this isn't actually a uniparty with two slightly different wings of the same wholly controlled bird, but that instead, if we could just get our, quote, side to win completely, all things, at long last, would swiftly improve in short order. To those with sufficient context to see through it, all of this causes great disillusionment, demoralization, nihilism, and despair, a feeling that there's little hope. While scores of others are locked into ridiculous battles within this broken framework, many of you listening undoubtedly look on with some mixture of anger, sadness, annoyance, knowing that it's not a question of which political party has the correct answers within this framework, but rather that the entire framework itself has become something of a prison and is now rotten to its very core. Now again, it's fairly easy to say such things, but it's much more difficult, of course, to envision alternatives, especially as we're so deeply immersed in our present way of doing things. And many have taken on this increasingly relativistic attitude that there are no ideal solutions, only differences of opinion, each of which might be justified, each of approximately equal worth, and that answers and solutions here are all dependent on personal perspective. But I feel this is a deception. I don't think the most accurate or right or healthy answers to the questions of how to best live are actually subjective or purely a matter of personal opinion. In some form or fashion, I've thought about these questions just about all of my life in various ways, and have come to believe strongly that there are some objective and definitive answers, and I hope to convince you of their rightness by the end of this cast, and perhaps a few others like it in the future. One of the broader concepts I've become so drawn to in recent years is that of finding creative and powerful means and methods of drawing the best and brightest upward, and finding ways to systematically bar the way to the opposites. An ideal route to accomplish this goal seems to be fostering healthy competition and having every last element of our systems and structures be fully evidence-based, meaning consciously working to remove the black magic of deceptive advertising, of manipulative deceit, of corrupt nepotism, and the effortless triumph of money. These dark forces and energies have gradually corrupted nearly all spheres, and until they're somehow effectively neutered, nothing changes. We've all just gradually come to accept things like when we see a vendor offering a product for free or at a massive discount in exchange for a review being written, a review that, of course, is glowingly positive the vast majority of the time. Many companies now outright buy reviews and feedback, and there are even a multitude of new services catering to just this. We've witnessed the normalization of social media accounts buying follows, or likes, or reposts, or artificial engagement. We've seen the gaming of polls on places like Twitter, Amazon choosing to hide negative reviews for books or movies it happens to support the politics of. Or, for a larger example, simply consider our last presidential election in the US. These just represent an extremely small handful of how this broader structure of feedback and judgment and discernment guiding our collective choices is now utterly broken, and this brokenness has become normalized. It's now unsurprising, even expected. Money can simply buy success here in a great many cases. And even if you or I may tend to see through it most of the time, especially in the most egregious cases, a great many people either still don't or don't care enough to. And I'd argue the net effects of this tilted playing field end up being larger than most of us could possibly comprehend. This corruption makes these ratings and reviews and feedback systems essentially worthless, only there to fool, manipulate, and deceive, utterly broken, and worse than worthless, of course, because it's now an arena in which the deceptive and dishonest prevail, which of course is the polar opposite of the ideal. I'd suggest the most effective way to begin to solve this issue is to cultivate a structure that forces everything to rise and fall entirely on its own proven merits. Again, evidence-based is the key term here. If you're looking for a commercial pilot, for example, You might develop a wide range of tests to directly measure piloting competence across all spheres, doing all you can to ensure every relevant factor is being fully considered. And then, the highest scoring handful of individuals eventually become pilots. Not because of who they know, not because they're Jewish, or a racial minority, or a woman, or belong to or are highly connected to the dominant political party, or attended the right school. Every possible avenue for gaming and corrupting the system needs to be obliterated, and all things must be purely evidence-based. Let's try to provide an example here. Let's say in a parallel community setting, new architects or home designers were sought, their goal being the design of a handful of homes that struck the best possible balance between overall cost, functionality, beauty, and aesthetics, and whatever other factors were deemed most important at the outset. Let's say each prospective candidate offers up their designs, anonymously, to be judged by all other candidates, and any others with relevant knowledge in these spheres. Moreover, we'll inform these judges that their positive or negative ratings or opinions of each design will be somehow automatically logged and noted down for posterity. And if several of these designs are implemented over time, the overall satisfaction of the individual that ends up occupying the home, as well as the cost of construction, the time and labor involved, and any other important and quantifiable factors, will be compared to their judgments. Insofar as they've highly rated the designs that ended up proving best, and more lowly rated the designs that proved broadly inferior, their opinions and judgments will be weighted more highly in the future accordingly. In other words, the vote strength, how much a person's judgment is considered relative to every other judgment offered up, will vary in a fluid way over time, according to the approximate quantifiable accuracy of their judgments in the past. Of course, this provides all the more incentive to judge accurately and correctly, and serves as yet one more measure to ensure nepotism or corruption doesn't in any way infect the overall structure. Now, this is just one imperfect random example, and of course, such ideas aren't incredibly valuable at the outset, and instead this manner of doing things would probably grow much stronger with more time and greater numbers of individuals involved, meaning it'd benefit from a larger community with a greater number of judgments noted and tracked across the years. But the specifics of how it might be carried out aren't necessarily the point here. The broader and all-important point is that by developing some purely evidence-based means and methods of judgment and discernment across every single sphere we possibly can, with the goal of everywhere allowing merit to rise to the top, and allowing and encouraging those lacking in it in this particular sphere to continue to seek and find their ideal roles or occupations elsewhere, I believe we'd have the power to vastly improve things, our cultures and communities, and how we live. I've spoken previously how my own ideal vision is an environment in which virtually everyone is devoted to one of three paths: learning, doing, or teaching. Those who haven't yet found their ideal path of mastery, which of course might be the majority, especially at the outset, would be encouraged to move between educational or apprenticeship type settings in the role of student until they did. And I believe, ideally, there should be absolutely no negative stigma attached to this. Even if the process takes several years for some and involves frequent missteps, those who do sufficiently master a given path and definitively prove themselves to be better than average in whatever given role or discipline they've learned would then devote themselves to putting this knowledge to good use and doing. And finally, the cream of the crop in each of these spheres, especially those with proven communication skills, would have the responsibility to share their knowledge as efficiently as is possible, to create new masters and mastery, to continue this cycle. And even here, in the realm of teaching, these same evidence-based means and methods would, ideally, be employed to ensure our time and energy was being used in the most efficient ways possible. To provide one more brief example here, in a schooling or educational capacity, a teacher of any subject could have his students' proficiency tested on the way in to the lesson, as well as at its commencement, and have these values compared. It's important that the formulations of these questions asked and answered in these tests be done with great care and attention to ensure there was no way to, quote, teach to the test or in any way game the system, or formulate any lesson plan entirely around their students being able to ace a specific set of questions. And just how exactly all of this might be structured would be open for a fair amount of debate and discussion. The main point here, the core concept I hope everyone might understand, is that we should, in all spheres, seek to, as completely as possible, eliminate guesswork and assumption and speculation, and that relativism that both causes it and springs from it. And again, much of this represents longer-term goals and visions, and will require sufficient time, a sufficient number of people involved, and a fair bit of planning and doing. But to give one more example of the philosophy and core conception at play here, one of the arenas that this approach might be applied to that most intrigues me is that of medicine. Currently, it's an absolute minefield to navigate. We sell hundreds of medications that are essentially massive profit-making enterprises, a great many of which seem to be placebos at best, and something profoundly harmful with hidden long-term consequences at worst. Nearly everyone that's had any involvement with this world, to the extent that they're being transparent and honest, will admit that money absolutely dominates, and that advertising and hype, coupled with doctors being privately bribed and cajoled in various ways, completely runs the show at present. Scientific studies, a term that should probably be in quotes here, are also routinely bought and paid for. And even the safeguards we might try to set up here are routinely made worthless, because when there's so much profit potential to be had, loopholes are always found and exploited to the hilt. But imagine an environment in which, if you have a serious ailment, let's just say regular severe headaches, to provide a specific example, you are prescribed a potential cure based entirely on its proven track record and nothing else. Moreover, if someone strongly believes they've uncovered a new or even rediscovered an old or ancient remedy for severe headaches in this case, they might somehow add it to the rotation of prescriptions. And over time, and based on the direct feedback of the patient, along with any definitive medical testing that might be done to objectively determine whether their situation has improved or worsened, such a structure could begin to develop an entirely evidence-based solution, one that had the most clear and direct history of helping cure or minimize the ailment, while simultaneously having the lowest number of side effects or any negative ramifications in the process. Or, to throw out one more random example to better illustrate the point, let's say a new restaurant or diner or similar entity opens up and they're seeking a new chef or cook. Imagine allowing multiple applicants to do the job and simply keeping track of the sum total of customer feedback on the days in which each of these applicants was at the helm. And after a sufficient amount of time to where the data began to speak for itself, simply hiring the best of these. And any time new talent is needed, this same process is repeated. The crux of this idea is very simple. Find some way to create a concrete means of testing proficiency, and then foster healthy and friendly competition. Simple, and yet with the potential to be incredibly powerful, if consciously pursued by a large enough group of people for a sufficient amount of time. It should be noted here that, of course, it's not always easy to create a subjective basis for judgment, or to be able to quantify or score or rank one thing against another thing of a similar type. Picture the more creative fields like painting, sculpture, works of literature. But even here, with some creativity, I believe some structure might be created in which the opinions and feedback of those with the most experience and or mastery in these spheres those with the best handle on them, or those we collectively consider the bests in the given field, might be harnessed to help sort and sift wheat from chaff. One idea of how this might function would be to allow public feedback to gradually create a judgment hierarchy in every individual sphere. For example, let's say this hypothetical society were to allow ongoing voting to select its greatest artists. These handful of artists would have their own votes in these spheres, weighted according to their own ranking, meaning the foremost highly ranked artist would have the most weighty and impactful vote with regard to judgment of other artists and works of art. The idea being that his increasingly keen eye and greater experience in this particular sphere might help him be a better judge than, say, the average man plucked off the street. But the core concept here is what matters, however it's carried out. The important element is that this hypothetical society and its judgments and rankings would be engaging in this behavior very purposefully and as a conscious communal effort aimed at self-improvement, with the goal of creating a more efficient, more beautiful, more energizing and engaging and life-affirming environment. And let's pull back quite a bit for a moment to better explain why I feel such a structure would be such an incredible net positive relative to the present. Each of us has a finite amount of time and energy to devote to accomplishing various things in life. One of the foremost goals of any state or nation or governmental structure, insofar as they exist at all, might be thought of, ideally, as ensuring that this time and energy is harnessed and channeled in a manner that fundamentally improves things in some way. The oldest and most basic examples of such structure and organization might be hunting parties to procure food, engineers or craftsmen or architects to help build homes and shelters from the elements, or feasting halls or communal gathering places, martially minded and proficient leaders to provide for defense against threats. One could go on for quite a while listing examples. But I hope we can all agree, not all uses of time and energy are equal. Some are incredibly beneficial in a direct and obvious way. Again, consider the farmer or cattle rancher or hunter producing food, the lumberjack producing a constant supply of wood for the purpose of building or heating and warmth, the textile manufacturer creating clothing. But some are far less beneficial, and especially in our age, some have spiraled out into not just neutral territory with regard to their obvious benefit, but actually seem to be obvious net negatives. The man who runs a large pornography empire, or an illicit drug trade, or a massive pharmaceutical company seeking profit above all else, or the advertising executive who competes with his advertising executive counterpart across the way to sell a relatively useless or even harmful product to the public at large, and who focuses on the best way to dishonestly and manipulatively create the hype and lust for said product in the first place. Also, the men involved in the manufacture of that useless product, or junk food. I'd suggest the raw percentage of men devoting the bulk of their time and energy down paths that aren't a net benefit to the world at large has perhaps never been higher. This problem becomes all the more apparent when you remain pulled back just about as far as your perspective can manage, and consider that our world seems to be swiftly growing uglier, our natural environment increasingly polluted, its natural balance and ecosystem increasingly damaged and destroyed, and that there's an undeniable growing undercurrent of despair, hopelessness, aimlessness, and that this is, increasingly, now producing epidemic levels of drug addiction, suicide, increasing crime rates, and an explosion of mental disorders. All of these, and so much more, represent problems that need fixing. And to fix them, of course, they require a devotion of some time and energy. So when it becomes understood that we're essentially wasting an utterly massive amount of time and energy down paths that are in no way directly beneficial to either the individual or the group, it should be clear to all that this is a deeply broken, flawed, inefficient, and sickly system we're operating within. The only hope to turn this tide would be to first clearly recognize the present state of things, and then to consciously set about to craft a systematic and structural solution accordingly. And this is why this broader idea so draws and intrigues me. It might be thought of as a harnessing of our collective judgment and intuition, to try to once again learn to say, this is better than that, and to embrace and magnify all that we consider best, and reject and minimize all that we consider inferior or unhealthy or worst. And to do so not only in a powerful and efficient way, but almost in an automatic or effortless way, because ideally and eventually all of this might be hard-coded into the structure. Of course, there are 100 arguments to be made as to how any structure like the one I'm broadly speaking to here might possibly stumble or fail in narrow and specific ways, and might fall short of perfection, but this strikes me as a flawed way to look at things. The question isn't, is this structure flawless and perfect? The far more relevant and operative question is this structure better than what we have now, and does it have great long-term potential? And I believe the answer, on both counts, is a resounding yes. Not only this, but all that truly matters is the underlying conception of learning to engage and channel our collective judgment and discernment to help aggressively minimize corruption and deception and manipulation, and ensure the best and brightest succeed as often as is possible. And again, it's only this core conception that truly matters, not so much the specifics of how we might finally decide to carry it out. I'd suggest one of the biggest problems we face in modernity, far and away at the top of the long list, is that a certain type of relativism has opened the door to fostering an abysmal lack of good judgment, and has helped create scores of people who no longer even attempt to practice this good judgment. Like the modern artists who brazenly and shamelessly fill art galleries with things like urinals, or a canvas painted a single color, or a tennis ball hanging from a string, and call it great and groundbreaking art. We've increasingly become nations and societies that have lost our discerning eye, and our ability and willingness to state with confidence, this is more beautiful than that. This is more healthy than that, or more vital and energizing, or more graceful and sublime. Just because there is indeed some amount of subjectivity in the world of art, to stick with this example, certainly doesn't mean that a urinal is in any way equal to the Sistine Chapel, or a sculpture of the Italian masters or Hellenic Greece, or that a Soviet-looking block of modernist architecture is in any way comparable to the Notre Dame Cathedral. Only the most deeply confused and disoriented mind could ever even remotely disagree with these statements, and, by doing so, they've begun to make some headway in deeply disorienting and confusing the entire world. Virtually all formerly concrete standards have been thrown into question and into disarray, and I'd suggest this was the entire point and goal. I think those most responsible for these changes were and are ugly men, often inside and out. And in doing everything in their power to manifest this inversion, they are essentially fighting for their tribe and their banner. I believe the only way to undo this monstrous misstep and get back on course is to consciously champion and cultivate good judgment, to again take it seriously, to consciously strive to develop an eye capable of recognizing health and beauty, capable of inspiration and aspiration. I've mentioned in the past, and again a moment ago, that I believe an ideal parallel society might aim to have virtually every last member of its population doing one of three things, either teaching, learning, or doing. With regard to teaching and learning, my own vision would be a vastly expanded notion of these things. A society that wholly devotes itself to finding the greatest possible natural and innate skill set within each and every one of its individuals, and then helps cultivate these to their highest and greatest possible degree. Of course, not every individual is capable of great genius or artistry or brilliance in the traditional senses. But a person with pronounced social skills and the ability to connect with others, for example, can serve the greatest and most positive use. Someone who works well with their hands and can provide some niche task far better than others, again, can serve a very valuable purpose. It may take some individuals years of moving through various learning environments to find the path that most suits and resonates with them, and that they most excel at relative to others. But I'd love to someday see an environment that encourages and applauds this constant searching, and sees it for the immense net benefit to all that it is. I even believe it should be free of charge, while simultaneously finding some creative means to compensate the teachers according to their effectiveness. But these specifics and details would be a digression, and are a topic for another day. I believe one of the most important steps toward fundamentally positive changes on these fronts would be a conscious shift in mindset and focus from our current framework and mode of thinking, increasingly prevalent in modernity, which so prizes the external, the material, the superficial, and toward its opposite, a society geared entirely toward building healthy and well-oriented and deeply capable people with fundamental knowledge and skill sets, as opposed to questing after mere financial gain, or expending time and energy to create the outward impression of success in the manner that so many on social media and platforms like Instagram, for example, seem to be doing at present. Such a massive waste of time and energy. And it's contagious. Such obviously net negative behavior, seemingly driven by deep insecurity and some desire to fill a void within, and the type of void that can't ever be filled by taking these paths. Instead of manifesting all the outward trappings in hopes that they somehow magically fill this void, an ideal society would ensure that void never existed in the first place, so far as humanly possible. That the internal realm represented the first and foremost priority, and that this obsession with the superficial and peripheral elements gradually became a distant memory. So what types of things represent a focus on fundamentals, as opposed to distractions and great drains of time and energy and attention? Again, I feel this question can be easily answered, and definitively and relatively objectively so. Just think of any realm in which we can definitively state X is superior to Y. An example, being physically fit and healthy is definitively superior to being morbidly obese and trapped in a failing body. And, just like that, we have a viable goal to quest toward. Being surrounded by beauty helps uplift and inspire beautiful thoughts and actions. Therefore, beauty seems definitively superior to ugliness. And so, once again, just like that, we have another viable goal. Picture a society consciously creating as many of these viable goals to quest toward as they're able to envision, and setting down all of these paths simultaneously. A return of good judgment, a return of self-discipline, a triumph again of order over chaos, generative nature over degeneracy, virtue and efficiency over corruption and waste. One more thing I wanted to briefly touch on before I draw this subject to a close for the moment, though I think I'll probably continue on this subject in another audio very soon, perhaps even the next, is the concept of sport and play and leisure. It's certainly true that hard work can help ennoble a people, and working in a direct and fruitful way toward simple and straightforward and easily discernible positive ends can be extremely rewarding. Again, think of a farmer putting in the work to raise feed cattle or grow food. It's incredibly obvious that the products of his own labor are feeding himself, his family, and possibly a great many others. But having said this, I get the feeling that many people have this notion of, quote, returning to tradition as being a path of endless hardship or difficulty, perhaps lacking in fun, novelty, light-hearted enjoyment of life, etc. Nothing could be further from the truth, at least from my own perspective. Yes, every individual should learn the value of hard work toward some genuine and worthwhile goal. But the strengthening and hardening of an individual doesn't necessarily come from hard labor, and certainly not from mindless tedium. Again, I'm drawn to the example of sport. Those who've been drawn to any competitive game in their lifetimes probably know the feeling of losing yourself in the spirit of competition, or in the fun and enjoyment and unique mental state that results, only to find yourself an hour or 2 or 3 later, pleasantly exhausted and wondering where the time flew. If the game you've been playing is even a halfway decent one, you've probably drawn much of value from it, almost certainly without recognizing it, and effortlessly. Demanding physical sports help build and refine and hone the body, hand-eye coordination, often our ability to organize and work as teams, often our ability to better understand and communicate effectively with one another. They can also teach us a fair bit about ourselves. A long hike or exploration of nature might produce similar physical benefits, while also teaching you something about your surroundings and your natural world. The point here is that we can strengthen and harden and improve ourselves through sport, play, and several types of behaviors usually classified as leisure or games. Again, I greatly appreciate Nietzsche's conception and term for this, which he called otium, and in his opinion, it was an absolutely necessary ingredient in the development of higher natures and higher culture. In other words, if a man only worked as a pack mule throughout his life, the lack of novelty and range of experience and any engaging manner of sport and play might threaten to turn him into a narrow and even sometimes tedious human being. Sport and play and leisure can be absolutely key ingredients in a healthy environment in the long term, and under the best of circumstances can yield the most positive benefits without virtually any of the drawbacks of attaining these benefits down other paths. So, while I strongly believe the ideal society and environment would seek to master the art of hard and fruitful work toward worthwhile goals, I've come to believe just as strongly that the ideal is to simultaneously master the art of fruitful play, and that both of these are necessary ingredients, even simply to help produce happiness and a love of life's sweetness and high points. We need to learn how to play properly again. Some might be thinking, well, if there's one thing modernity does do properly, even in excess, it's play. And yes, we've certainly misused and abused our great successes in spheres like automation to devote an ever larger bulk of our hours to forms of play. This is undeniable. The problem here is that not all play is created equal. And here, again, I believe there is some fairly objective, definitive, quantifiable measuring stick to compare X to Y. What makes one form of play superior to another? I'd suggest the answer is how much you draw from it. In other words, to what extent does it more positively orient or shape you, or inform or strengthen and improve you? Some things that masquerade as play in our age are actually just superficial addictions, which we throw ourselves into mindlessly to fill the hours, or as some form of escapism. There's a depressing video floating around that many of you may have seen on social media of scores of older people playing slot machines in what seems to be Vegas, and not excitedly or enthusiastically in the manner of someone who just discovered this new and novel form of play, but soullessly and repetitively, in such a way that you can tell they've been doing this for weeks, months, if not many years. This is an unfortunate example of great waste, and the type of habit that in no way positively shapes or orients a person. Much like playing 10,000 hours of some cheap, one-dimensional gaming app, it's the epitome of diminishing returns, both in terms of any positive effect it may be having on the brain, as well as any happiness it might be producing. In summary, whether this energy is drained to directly feed a parasitic element, or whether it's outright wasted and the most fruitless dissipation. The end result is largely the same, especially from the perspective of the individual or group suffering the loss. Time and energy that might be used in a vastly superior way is instead squandered. And if we were capable of somehow charting the consequences of this massive amount of wasted human potential, I have no doubt we'd be floored. It's almost equivalent to having a fuel tank with several holes in it. The vehicle may still technically run, but its performance is nowhere near what it could and should be. Although this analogy is imperfect, because it's not just a waste of fuel, but that the fuel itself becomes vastly inferior, incapable of producing the level of power and performance its inherent design makes it capable of. And I see this is already over an hour, so I'll wrap this up for now. And I think I'll save the rest of what I intended to discuss for the next cast, which I hope to start recording in the next couple of days. To attempt to summarize the key points of all I've spoken to here, we live in an age with the power and potential to significantly free up our individual and collective time and energy, but an age that simultaneously absolutely surrounds us with net negative addictions and distractions. We live in an age in which our ability to communicate and connect effortlessly across vast distances opens up countless doors to the creation of powerful new organizations and hierarchy, but an age that simultaneously has allowed for a monopolization of mediocrity and corrupt nepotism to prevail here, creating vast networks of individuals, experts at promoting themselves and those in their club, even, and some might say especially, in cases in which this promotion is completely undeserved, and in which it has the most net negative effect. In short, we live in an age of incredible potential that's presently being incredibly squandered. Insofar as we have the will, we have the ability to step aside, to cease devoting the bulk of our life force to this irrevocably broken and vampiric machine, and to slowly but surely create something new. And as we do so, at every step along the way, to consciously avoid reintroducing these same poisonous elements, and in fact craft the structure itself to prevent their resurgence or reoccurrence, and to eventually reach a vastly higher potential in so doing. Tremendous respect to those already doing the actual work and breaking new ground in various efforts at parallel communities and structures and institutions, especially those in the Ozarks. I hope some portions of this cast provided something to discuss or think about, and I look forward to visiting, at the very least, someday soon. And to any and all like minds tuning in, I sincerely hope you're all well, and thank you for listening.
This is the end, beautiful friend. This is the end, my own.